Yeah, it's spilling. Okay. Depending on the estimates used, there are up to one language that goes extinct every 2 to 7 days. However, when we look at these languages, it might appear as if they just go extinct out of nowhere, that there's no factor, it's just luck. However, if you look really deeply into it, there are some major factors involved that don't appear right away. Let's start with defining some terms. There you go. Extinction is when there are no longer any native speakers of that language left alive, and survival is when there's a language that continues to be used and sustains itself with new speakers. So, first factor are the actual speakers themselves. Now it may appear that to have a language that can survive very well, that you're going to need as many speakers as possible. However, that isn't actually true because, let's take a look at some examples. There are 3 languages that I'm going to talk about, and their estimates come from 3 sources, which is Ethnologue, National Geographic, and UNESCO estimates. So the first language are, well, there are 3 languages in Indonesia specifically. However, they have millions of speakers, but due to the way that the language has developed over the past few decades, they may have millions of speakers, however, they're all old, meaning that eventually, as those old speakers die off, those languages will disappear. Another example is Tuvan, which has a few 100,000 speakers, but has recently become stabilized. In the past, they weren't, so they were actually on the path to be extinct. The last example is Latin. It has a few thousand speakers, but is relatively stable, as in more stable than the other 2, because it sustains itself with the new speakers, well, as they become born, I guess. And also the second bit, the language must be used by members of different age groups. That's the important bit. It's not absolute number of speakers. It's a wide variety of speakers. And also another thing, depending on your location, this one actually involves a bit of luck. Your population of your language has to be comparable in size with other languages. If it becomes smaller over time, that's when you get into a bit more danger because of it being overpowered from other languages. So having a continuous flow of new speakers is a great factor to have for survival. But stability isn't the only thing. There's language use. For language use, there are actually more factors than necessary, but I did merge them. There is this person named Mufone, who that in a journal has described that in some cases, when people stop using their own language in favor of another language, it's as if a good proportion of the population of that language consulted with each other and decided collectively to shift suddenly to another language. Now, it's not actually the entire population just conversing with each other saying, hey, let's switch to another language. No, it's actually a gradual thing over time, but the speed of them switching to another language can differ depending on what is going on. If people think other languages are more useful, then they are more likely to switch to that language. Because if you're speaking a language with no actual use that is beneficial to you, then what's the point of speaking it? You might as well move on to something that is actually beneficial. For smaller languages, that is detrimental because one speaker switching to a different language or gradually shifting to a different language has more of an impact than if there were millions of speakers and only one moves. Globalization is one of the reasons that it's also a great factor because English has sometimes been described by Mufene and also this other person named Bai as being a killer language, but it's not like English actually goes to other languages and kills them. No. It's because of its usefulness worldwide. It just takes away the speakers from an existing language and shifts them to using another language more and more. The way English causes a shift is unique that it has more of an impact than all the other globalized languages because of its impact in not only everyday use in globalized situations such as business or industry, but also because of its influence in the media and how it affects the languages. Right? So the media is also important because this is one of the ways where you can actually provide more uses for your language. If there is a language that is on the path to extinction, that may be because the people aren't tending to use it more and more. There aren't new speakers coming in. Or there are a lot more speakers leaving the use of that language than are actually coming in. But if you provide actual uses such as the written word, prints, books, newspapers, and all that, then there actually is some use. And the more uses that become available, the more other uses become available, such as you might start with newspapers in your language, like Tubin actually specifically stated. But then you might move on to actual television programs, news on the TV, and so on. And the broad usage is also important. If you just focus on a single one, then the vulnerability is still there. But if you keep it wide and keep its usage broad, then like English, you're going to have more speakers coming to it, because they're not going to be leaving the use of that language, so to speak. Although for the media, the shift is slower, but it's still there. Another way of bringing more speakers to keep the language alive is education. Now with education, it's a little more hard to control, because the policies that are enacted from education can be from government, and that is it's harder to control. But I'm going to use Hawaiian as an example. Hawaiian used to be on the path to extinction because there are less and less speakers using it every year. But the Hawaii State Department of Education actually started policies where they started teaching Hawaiian in their schools. Like there was like French immersion, there's Hawaiian immersion. And because the usage of Hawaiian was quite small, they decided, let's make an actual dictionary. And with the dictionary, it actually helps with education, because you have a good source to rely upon the language, just in case that, in case your language becomes too small, you don't have enough sources to get vocabulary or grammar from. You have a dictionary that you can actually rely on. Let's see. Oh. One language, such as in Vanishing Voices, there was Seri. That language created dictionary as one of the reasons, because education for the people was important, because they needed to get new speakers, because they were dwindling on the few hundreds. The estimates provided were between 600 and 1,000. It may not seem as important, because the gradual shift of bringing in new speakers is slower than all the rest of the factors, where the shift leaving them was a lot more. The importance of this is that with more education, there will be more people later on to actually help bring in more speakers for that language. And as I mentioned earlier, there's another factor that is even more hard to control than education, and that's government and its policies. Government is hard to control because there are too many factors going on with the government itself. And the people running the government or in the government might not actually care about your language. Oh, darn it.
Okay, I heard that one of the solutions is to have a dictionary to preserve the language.
Yeah.
But doesn't that only work if it's a written language? What if it's an oral language?
Well, a language having its own written system is helpful, but it's not the only way to write it. There's IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet, and you can use that if the language doesn't have its own unique writing system. Like the Indonesian languages that I talked about in the first slide with its factors. Indonesia's government has a policy that all languages in Indonesia should be written using a Latin alphabet. However, with diacritics, not just the 26 available in English, you have to use diacritics, and each language might have different rules, like let's say the letter J could be this sound, but it's a different sound. So it's not the best way, but in Indonesia it does work because the languages are quite similar. So you can assume a sound for each letter, and most of the time you will be right. But for other languages, you might have to just rely on IPA because it doesn't have its own writing system or a writing system to rely upon.
What about audio dictionaries? What do you think about that?
Yeah, there is Okanagan, which is in the interior, and there is this one band called Incommit, where they actually have, well, the formatting is a bit old, but then they have these cards with magnetic strips on them. And what they did back then, before storage became a lot larger for small, they got each card and they had to get each individual word on there because they didn't have a written language. So they would write in English on that card what the word is. They would write what it sounds like, and then they would have the actual spoken bit in that magnetic strip. Now, there are better methods these days, but back then that's what they had to rely on for audio.
Okay. In your conclusion, which you didn't have time to finish, was there a particular source that really informed your resolution or conclusion?
The best way in which I think I found factors for it, which I was going to go back to, was UNESCO, because they're a world organization, they have the most information available on the factors that contribute to languages' survivals and their extinction. So I was going to rely on that for a bit of the conclusion. Another great, well, I wouldn't say a source, but great sources came from this other person named Funny, as I mentioned before. There was this journal which talked about language's death, what kind of factors there were. And although in that journal there was some math involved, which I didn't include because I would have needed time to explain it, that did help with my presentation.
Okay, thanks, Jamie.